Okay, so we'll start. Sarah, over to you, and I will be right here for you if you need anything.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and depending on where you're joining us from today. I'm Sarah Gooding, Managing Director of We Communications in Africa, based in Johannesburg. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to episode 8 in the ICCO Ignite webinar series, in which we are focusing today on climate and ESG, diving into meaningful change in this arena. Around the world, organizations are facing growing expectations to demonstrate real progress on climate and ESG commitments. We know this. Yet at the same time, trust is becoming harder to earn. Ipsos research shows us that while concern about climate change remains really high, with 74% of people concerned about its impact in their countries, many are becoming disengaged and increasingly expect organizations and brands to take the lead in driving solutions in this space. This places immense pressure on communicators who are really based at the center of this complex challenge. We're expected to help organizations tell authentic stories about sustainability and social impact, whilst ensuring at the same time that those stories withstand growing regulatory, investor, and public scrutiny. And perhaps more importantly, we're being asked to help organizations move beyond just communicating commitments to helping drive meaningful change. So today's discussion, we're going to explore exactly that. No small topic and no small task. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by 4 communications experts today, bringing their perspectives to this discussion. In alphabetic order, we have Chris Pratt, who is Managing Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at Burson. We have Johannes Neymaar-Stach, co-founder and Managing Director of the Orca Evolution. Marian Zeuchbayer, co-founder and Managing Director of the Academy of Climate Change, and Susie Giles, Managing Director of Giles Global. I'm going to just indulge me for a minute and just let me give you a little bit of a background on each of these individuals. So Chris has worked in the communications industry and policy advisory for the last 25 years. He's currently based in London. He's worked around the world and helps organizations with their sustainability, social impact performance, and communications. Chris is a co-chair of the PRCA Climate Advisory Board. He's spent several years studying the role of corporations in driving sustainable change and has a master's in sustainability leadership from the University of Cambridge. Johannes is a climate innovation and sustainability leader. He's held roles with the WWF, the Austrian Federation, a federal procurement agency, and the EIT Climate, KIC, where he served as Austria's first national general manager. He founded 288 Grad Consulting, a boutique consultancy with a major focus on climate action and innovation management for clients. He's also the co-founder of Project Orca, a non-for-profit incubator and launchpad for climate-related initiatives. He's developed a masterclass with ICCO, which I'm sure you'll hear a bit more later, amongst others, for sustainability communicators. And since 2026, he's also been an investor supporting impactful startups and strengthening climate innovation ecosystems. Marian studied economics and has had many years of experience in management consulting and organizational development. Also co-founder of the Academy of Climate Action, she uses her expertise in advising a wide range of companies and her comprehensive know-how on ESG topics to support organizations in their green transformation. Her superpower, preparing and communicating knowledge in such a way that others can benefit from it. And Susie, last but not least, as Managing Director of Giles Global and Chair of the UNDP Climate Communications Task Force, Susie brings more than 2 decades of global experience spanning ESG communications, reputation management, sustainability strategy, and brand transformation across EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. from advising multinational organizations on anti-greenwashing and ESG narratives to founding the CIPR ESG network and leading conversations on climate communications, resilience, misinformation, and responsible leadership. Her work continues to shape how organizations communicate impact with authenticity and credibility. Susie, now based in New Zealand after nearly a decade in the Netherlands, is focused on helping organizations build a more positive future to inspire the next generation of experts. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much to the four of you for joining us today. Let's dive right in. So as a starting point, we're going to just look at the current ESG communications landscape. We've seen sustainability communications evolve dramatically over the past decade. If we were having this discussion 5 years ago, we'd probably have been talking about awareness. Today, we're talking about credibility and measurable impact. Huge amounts of pressure on organizations. And I'd love to ask each of you, what has fundamentally changed in climate and ESG communications over the last few years? And what is driving that shift? I think I will start with you first, Susie, since we
Thank you.
spoke about you. So yeah, let's hear from you.
Cheers. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think, as you say, not that long ago, we were trying to just persuade organisations that they needed to communicate about this, and now we're expecting a lot more from them. I think there's no doubt that the regulatory landscape has had an impact. A very recent report that's come out from GlobeScan has noted, well, these were interviews with chief sustainability officers, that the biggest driver for communicating is still regulation and compliance. But also there's been an increase in stakeholder expectations, whether that's your employees or whether that's your customers. So I think that we can't deny that has made a difference. I think it's tricky though, because if you look over the last 5 years, although that has increased, we're now in this weird situation where we have certain regions of the world which are politically polarized, and so that's having an opposite impact, where it's just becoming a much trickier topic to talk about. So it's quite complex.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. Thanks, Susie. Staying with the ladies, Marion, can we hear from you?
Yeah, thanks. Well, of course, I would agree with Susie. Absolutely, it's much more complex now. When we talk about 2018, we had a high, right, in sustainability communications with Fridays for Future, and then all those crises came, and we saw definitely a shift based on those different crises and political changes as well. What Susie mentioned, I mean, diversity communication almost declined immediately after new administration in a well-known country. Organizations are not so super happy now talking about diversity, whilst probably working on it internally, but not talking about it. And maybe if we focus on climate, personally I think there was a shift. We had a discussion on climate denial years ago. Now that's not so much of an option because people are well aware of the climate crisis, but we see a delay in the transformation discussion. And together with this delay, we see a lot of disinformation, unfortunately. And what we also see is misinformation, which is not really sharing fake news by wanting people to know the wrong things, but people just are not able to put the complex information out there into the context. So that is where education comes in, actually.
Absolutely. Thank you. Johannes, over to
Yeah,
you.
I mean,
Staying
I
in
can build.
Austria and over to
Yes.
you.
Thank you. Exactly. Yes. Good afternoon from Vienna, Austria. Yeah, I mean, I can agree with all that that has been said so far. Just adding, maybe like say 1.5 years ago, I was in Ireland and I was teaching PR and communication experts, And I went to Ireland with this idea that this is an ever-growing topic, climate and ESG, and then I hit the reality of communication experts that had to face the European and the US American market and regulations. And they told me, we're basically in between two blocks. We don't know what to do. We must communicate to the one side, but we must not communicate one and the same thing to the other market for fear of retaliation. So that has changed over the last 1.5 years, I think. What has also changed is that I think over the last couple of years, it was understood that in particular in the climate sphere, there is no such thing as a sprint. There is no such thing as having loads and loads of low-hanging fruits and or compensating your way out of the transformation. So I think over the years, organizations have learned that they have to work harder, and that what they would have communicated, say, 5 to 10 years ago as low-hanging fruits, as climate successes, they prove to be incorrect, to say the least. So you would not communicate the same way now, 10 years on. So this criticism on excessive greenwashing, I think, comes exactly from the development that I just referred to, which is you need to know much better what you're doing. You need to be much more aware that this is a marathon. You need to be much more humble, and you really need to do something instead of sending money to a remote place to compensate what you're doing wrong inside your organization, but also within your value chain.
Yeah, you're spot on. We're going to talk a little bit more about a few of those elements a little bit later. Thank you. Chris, can we hear from you on that opening remarks on the current ESG communications landscape?
Thank you, and thanks for including me in this webinar. I think I would agree with what my colleagues have said already. I think context is everything in communications, and we're dealing with a very different context today than we had only 2 years ago. I think we talk about ESG, and ESG itself as a term has largely fallen out of use. And why has it fallen out of use? Because it became a politically very toxic term, particularly driven by a US agenda. But at the same time, while there is a challenging geopolitical context, and while different audiences might express concern about the climate, I also think the context means that their priorities have changed as well. And I think what that's meant for communications is a need to make sure that to focus on relevance and to focus on talking about what's being done and what's being achieved in sustainability through a different lens. So when it comes to talking about decarbonisation, it's not necessarily always with the motivation first and foremost to deliver climate change. It might actually be about building resilience and building and reducing cost, because of course renewables now are so much more cost effective than they were even a few years ago. So the framing has shifted to reflect that changed context. But I would also say, I think, these things move in cycles. I think in a positive sense, we're very much in delivery phase right now. 5 years ago, everybody was setting long-term targets, and funnily enough, 2030 targets are now only, less than 4 years away, and actually they feel very real, and companies are now in delivery mode. And so the need for communications has become a bit more technical. The clients and organizations need sustainability communicators who understand changing frameworks for reporting and disclosure and how they have affected things. But I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think that context has changed and communications has adapted. We've lost those big glitzy campaigns. I think to some extent we've lost some of the C-suite who wanted to have their name up in lights next to fellow CEOs at big forums like WEF. But actually there's still a lot of work being done, a lot of action being taken, a lot of delivery happening. Is it fast enough? Not at all, but there is a lot of progress being made.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I guess a common thread emerging from all of your comments is this issue of trust. Stakeholders are definitely demanding more action, more transparency, and more proof of progress than ever before. So sticking with that theme of trust, in this era of skepticism, as we all know too well, Chris, you work with organizations worldwide on sustainability and social impact initiatives. What separates credible sustainability communications from corporate storytelling? And how do you believe organizations can find the right balance between saying too much and too little?
Yeah.
Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I mean, this is actually quite a complex area, and actually something that, to Susie's point earlier, there's a heck of a lot of regulations now at a national and a regional level that now govern green claims, govern what companies can say when it comes to their sustainability disclosures or their the way that they want to talk about their product, and there are more on the way. At the moment, in September this year, the EU will enact the Empowering Consumers Directive that will place a whole new basket of requirements around companies in terms of what they can and can't say in relation to the environmental performance of their products and their companies. And that regulation is very good. In many respects, it's provided a lot of clarity when there was none. And there was the significant potential only a few years ago for consumers and employees and other stakeholders to be misled by what companies have been saying about their performance, because those guardrails and that guidance wasn't necessarily in place. That said, I do a lot of training and work with a lot of clients in this space. Almost nobody goes into work each day thinking, I want to mislead consumers today about the environmental performance of my company. It doesn't happen deliberately often. Most cases it happens by accident. And that therefore means, when it comes to sustainability communications, companies need to arm themselves and arm their teams better to be ready to navigate that new regulatory context. I'd also say, whilst there is a great deal of complexity, I also think, actually, personally speaking, this comes down to a rather simple equation. And ultimately, you build trust in these markets by aligning what you're saying with what you're doing.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that. If you stick to talking about the impact you are having, the work you're doing today, the delivery that you've achieved, that is a relatively safe territory and doesn't risk greenwashing. You start to risk greenwashing when you start to become more future scoping, when you start to sort of look ahead, when you start to talk about or try to sort of use hyperbole, or try to sort of talk about things like, the recycled content of your product, but ignoring the fact that actually a lot of it is not recycled. That's when you start to get into territory that is problematic from a regulatory perspective. But sticking to that relatively simple equation is a good rule of thumb for communicators to stay on the safe side of regulations, but also on the safe side of trust and the trust in consumers.
That's amazing. So if you could sort of highlight what are the key characteristics of organizations that consistently earn stakeholder trust on ESG related issues, what would you highlight those as? And similarly, where do organizations commonly go wrong?
I think first and foremost, transparency. Transparency is fundamental in this space. The extent to which you as an organization are ready to be open about what you are achieving, but also to some extent what you're not achieving, what you actually found to be more difficult to achieve than you had expected, and therefore being transparent about that and helping others on their journey towards the sustainability by being open. So that transparency and openness is a key characteristic that I think stands organizations in good stead. I would also say, strong interdisciplinary cooperation. And what I mean by that is, in order to get good data out of the organization about impact, you need your sustainability, your legal, your comms, your operations team to be working to the same outcomes. And it doesn't always happen like that in many organizations, but it's fundamental to actually making sure that you've got strong, good data to be able to report on and talk about your progress that's being made. And then finally, being very compliance minded and knowing the frameworks, knowing the regulations, and making sure that you are following them, I think are important to make sure that you are not running the risk of misleading. And when do organizations most commonly get it wrong? I think, as comms people, as marketeers, we're always looking for ways to simplify and engage people in a way that, where the message is not overcomplicated. And it's an instinct that's important because we need people to be engaged with this. But sometimes I think those instincts can get in our way. And if we're using a visual, if we're trying to sort of convey something and use a visual that actually could be misleading, or if we ask if Earth Day is coming up and you ask the person who's running the social channels to think about an Earth Day post, it's the sort of thing you might do for other parts of your communications mix. But as soon as you start to do that in relation to sustainability, you open yourselves up to those accusations of greenwashing, because if you're not fundamentally doing something to contribute to Earth Day, if you've not actually got something to engage in that dialogue, then do you really deserve a place in that conversation? I think you've got to be really honest about these things and be careful with those instincts to oversimplify.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think just staying with that topic of green hushing, greenwashing, etc. If I can open this question to the panel, how do you believe organizations should respond when ESG claims are challenged publicly? Susie, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with, what Chris said. No one goes into work generally to say, I want to mislead. And, I feel for organizations I've worked with. I worked with a client who was preparing for the disclosure around the EU deforestation regulation, which then, after all that work, the EU decided not to launch twice. But the real problem actually was that the marketing communications team knew that they had to say something because customers were asking. It was the technical team who were not confident of having all the data. And so they were being very, very reluctant. And quite rightly, the marketing communications team brought me in and my team to say, we need an external voice because we need these guys to understand that this is a reputational issue. And actually, not saying anything is just as bad as greenwashing, actually, because it's not communicating is obviously communicating. It's communicating that you're not ready. It's communicating you're possibly hiding something. And it's really important that we have that information so that we have, as consumers, a real level playing field of information so we can make the right decisions, those informed decisions. So I think however difficult it is, transparency as far as possible is the way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Susie. Marion, can we hear from you?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Susie. I mean, first thing I would say, don't panic. So if you have the fact figures right, there is no need to panic if something is challenged. And then, of course, the question is, what is challenged? Is it the facts and figures that are challenged? Is it the attitude behind that is challenged? Is it the vision or the targets? So take a deeper look maybe on what is challenged, and do I really have an answer on that?
Yeah, that's true. Johannes, do you want to add anything to that from your side?
Yeah, I mean, just being a little more critical, maybe for the experiment that we are having here, being the devil's advocate. I mean, I received calls from organizations, say like 2 years ago, saying, "Hey Joe, can you help us greenwash?" And I was like, "Hey, we don't know one another. I think you mean, can you help me avoid you greenwash?" They would say no. We would want to do it until the 27th of September, possibly, which is when the Empowering Consumers Directive kicks in. So I've seen quite a lot different organizations proactively knowingly greenwashing their way through. And then this phenomenon of greenwashing that you had been raising, it's a clear consequence of not having rightly communicated, not having done the homework, not having run an LCA, not having prepared the facts, and so on and so forth. And I think organizations are really now waking up to the fact that in the past, they considered fact-based communication a nice to have at best, that this is now the new normal, right? From September onwards, basing everything on facts, that is what you have to do.
Yeah, you're spot on. Chris, anything from you in closing on that particular topic?
I would just add, Johannes talked about green hushing. I think, part of me feels that's really been driven from a leadership perspective, where leaders now don't necessarily want to attach their personal brand to sustainability and climate communications in quite the way that they have in the past. And I think, in many respects, these things are secular. The current context that we are dealing with will pass. And actually, I think those expectations from stakeholders have not gone away. And I think, finding the balance is critical. I understand why organizations find it difficult to put themselves out there in a context that is fluid and changing and dynamic and difficult. But I also think that actually those expectations haven't gone. If you are green hushing, I think you're leaving opportunities on the table. You're missing a chance to really engage and drive transformation through your organization in a way that actually will be provide much more added value in the longer run for your organization.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I guess ultimately trust comes from action and not just from communication. So turning onto a topic around communicators as change agents. Johannes, communicators are often brought into sustainability initiatives once the strategy has already been developed. So a question to you is, do organizations need communicators involved earlier in the process? And where can they add the greatest strategic value beyond simply communicating outcomes?
No, thank you for that question. A tricky one. I mean, out of my experience, I think bringing in communicators as early as possible makes a lot of sense. First, you bring in outside-in perspectives. You oftentimes get more of a stakeholder's perspective in internal processes. It is a very technical thing if you take it serious, like climate and ESG and so on. So starting communicating early makes absolute sense because you have lots to explain. You have lots of people, not only outside but also inside the organization, to be part of a greater thing of this endeavor. And you need to create momentum for it because ultimately, again, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And the earlier you involve people who can effectively and efficiently communicate, the better. I can also give you an example of how good might look or how not good might not look. The example of how not good looks is, so we have one former client of ours who used to be saying that the company is climate neutral. And then at one point, they needed to collect more data to be CSRD compliant, so to have the sustainability reporting. And what they got back from those who should have collected data is they said, well, we don't understand why we need to collect data on diesel, gasoline, or other emissions because the organization is climate neutral. So they thought whatever they do with some miracle stick, the organization in the very end would make everything climate neutral. And the problem then arose when controlling really wanted to get to all the data points they had to have, and they were just not replying in time, to be honest. So lying to yourself as an organization, claiming to be climate neutral and not explaining what it really means, that is also a problem in itself. And I kept asking, and still keep asking, possibly my counterparties, so you claim to be climate neutral, what does it mean? What makes you climate neutral? And interestingly, 99% would not be really able to explain what climate neutrality means, because it means reducing and avoiding emissions in the first place. A good example that I have brought with me is a startup that I had consulted a decade ago or something, that turned out to be a unicorn. And in say 2017 or something, before or like say in Series A sphere, so confronting the first investors, they already had an LCA of their product, which basically was a platform for refurbished products, right? So 10 years ago, they had a dedicated LCA made for products that were refurbished, that were resold on their platform. And I can tell that opened doors that would have been closed if they hadn't got any impact report with them, because they were just one of many who had this idea. And they started as a startup less than 10 years ago, and they are now worth more than €1 billion. So yeah, taking this serious impact, ESG and so on, right from the start or even earlier can make absolute sense also business-wise.
Well, yes, absolutely. So if you had to sort of highlight what are those top priorities that organizations are missing by involving communicators too late, how would you?
Yeah, so I think also to Chris's point, maybe the one thing is it's complicated, and you really need to start communicating early. The other thing is also I find oftentimes communicators have a hard job really understanding whether the product or whatever needs to be communicated really is as sustainable, as climate friendly as whatsoever, if they get late to the party. And if you involve them earlier, then they have a better chance, to say the least, to understand whether what they need to communicate is really true or not. They can ask better questions. And in some cases, they can also reach out to external experts, like ours, for instance, and then say, hey, listen, we need someone, a third party opinion, an expert opinion, because from the inside, we don't get the necessary information, or there's lots of bubbles inside an organization that don't communicate. Help me better understand how I can communicate better, more factfully, and so on.
So important. And I think just staying with that theme of transparency, which seems to be a recurring one in this whole ESG communications landscape, just opening it to the panel. If you could share, how important is transparency about the challenges, setbacks, and imperfections when communicating sustainability progress? And I don't know if you want to highlight any examples that you've come across. Susie, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about an example here in New Zealand, actually. So Air New Zealand launched a campaign, I think it was in 2022. So they had a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And they had a whole public campaign, lots of comms, lots of PR. Unfortunately, their ambitions were not matched by advances in sustainable aviation fuel. There wasn't necessarily the policy support behind it. So they actually had to roll back from that. And they did come in for a lot of criticism, as you'd expect. But it was really interesting, I think, how they handled it, because it wasn't necessarily that anyone was accusing them of misleading the public, but they were more confused as to why they made that particular decision if they didn't have all of that mapped out by that day. So now they've got more realistic targets, but also they now, I believe, have an annual 2030 emissions update. So which is based on where we are in the world today, because
Interesting.
you can't plan it. This is the problem. The targets that we are setting as organizations are out there. There could be two new sets of leadership by the time you get to that, at least that, if not more. So, but we tend to do business in quarterly reports. So the two things are very difficult to align. But I think Air New Zealand are an example of how you just have to come out and say, this is the reason why.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
now we're rethinking it and we're being more realistic about it. And
not in control of everything, but
no,
yeah, that's really interesting.
Are
Great,
we-
thank you so much. Great example. Marion, anything?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we have talked about trust already, right? I mean, a good brand is all about trust, I think, and I wouldn't trust a company who is only shiny, glossy, perfect. It's in all the impressions I have, yeah. So of course, it's absolutely necessary from a communications perspective to inform about setbacks or mistakes you made, and I also think it's key to the transformation, to the green transformation for us as a society. Because if we only talk about some probably perfect products, which I don't know yet, but some people believe there are some perfect sustainable products. If we only talk about that and the good news and the actions we made, it's a hindrance, I think, because if people believe that everything is fine, I can just buy this product and everything is good, how should we really manage this green transformation?
Yeah, how authentic and believable is that? Yeah, absolutely. Johannes, any thoughts or examples that spring to mind for you?
Yes and no. I think I agree with all that has been said. I mean, the only thing I want to add is it takes a long time to create trust. You cannot do it from one day to the other. And
Yeah.
so if trust has already eroded for some reasons, don't expect in the next quarter to have a dramatic change, obviously, but rather go for a mid to long term goal in that retrospect.
Absolutely.
I
Thank you.
think
Chris, any comments from you on this before we move
just
on?
just an example, and I think it's an often used example, and I'm sure it will be familiar to many. But Patagonia is obviously an organization who has woven sustainability into the fabric of its organization, and that in some respects makes it easier for them to be a leader. But they produced their first impact report at the end of last year, and it was striking because it was very honest. It was very honest about what they're doing and what they still feel they've not yet mastered and have more work to do. They had a brilliant content series attached to it where they had staff answering social media posts that were very skeptical about what Patagonia is doing, including one that was sort of, I'll paraphrase it, but the message was, hey Patagonia, thanks for donating 1% of the $800 jacket that I just bought for the planet. How generous of you. And then they had the staff taking on these sort of critical messages and sort of unpicking them and giving their version of events in a very unfiltered way. I mean, obviously, as communicators, we all know there must have been a degree of stage management involved in that, but it came across very authentically, and I think they really didn't. It wasn't an effort to try to gloss over. They were just very honest about what they'd done and what they still had to do.
I love that. Yeah, great example. And of course, I mean, even the strongest strategy can fall flat if audiences don't identify, relate to the messaging, and that's a great example. Okay, so moving on to communicating complexity and driving understanding. So Marion, much of your work focuses on climate education, being another theme that I think is sort of coming up recurring, and the use of terminology, etc., in this space. Climate science, biodiversity, transition finance, and scope 3 emissions are all highly complex topics. Where do you believe organizations most often get climate communications wrong when trying to engage employees, customers, or general communities and stakeholders?
Well, one thing, referring to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, probably that some communications focus too much on the what and not so much on the why. So I think this is really often missing. And then I do think exactly as you say, it's quite complex, some terms. In the end, probably not. I think it's easy to explain, but yes, for most people, it's still complex. And that's where I think communication is hard. It's hard to communicate something to people who just don't understand the terms and topics. So, especially when trying to engage employees, you first have to educate them. Have to give them the information. What does scope 3 mean? What is biodiversity about? Because we start talking about actions, and then we wonder why people are not really happy about the actions we take now, because they just don't understand it. They don't understand the background. So put really some effort in education, I think is really important. And then I think that you not always need to talk about emissions reduction when you do a climate action, because there are so many other co-benefits. So maybe sometimes it's better to use other arguments for communication than you use internally for deciding on the action. Because maybe it's not about emissions reduction, but it's about reducing pollution, or it's about becoming healthier. So these are two different ways of looking at some climate action. And the question is, what do I need to communicate? What do I want to communicate?
Yes. And what have you seen along those lines are approaches or channels that are proving the most effective for communicating and educating these different audiences?
Well, of course, it depends on the different target groups. But what's most important, what we see definitely, is to have formats where you engage people by participation. So it's not so much on information, but giving them space to discuss, to share different opinions, to ask critical questions. That's the most important thing, and not only internally with employees, where of course it's absolutely important, but also with customers or with other communities. So find a space where other people can really ask critical questions, put their ideas on, and share different opinions.
I love that. I love that. So staying with that theme, I mean, organizations are improving how they communicate sustainability, and we see that globally. But are communications, if it's genuinely changing understanding and behavior? Okay, so we're talking about this education piece. How, if we look and open this to the panel, how do organizations know when sustainability communications actually create action rather than simply awareness? And can you call out any examples where communications have actually contributed to meaningful behavioral change in audiences? So yeah, let's hear from the group. Susie, should we start with you?
Yes. Yeah. I think what's really important as communicators is we need to make sure that we're moving outside the normal measurement sphere that we sit within. And if you really want to measure effectiveness across organizations, then you really need to understand the organization. You need to, as Mariam was saying, it depends on the context of the organization, and the why is so important, because it has to mean something to people within organizations, or they just won't engage with it because they do not understand what's in it for me. I work with a fabulous company called Train Technologies in the US, and they have they're a HVAC company, and they had this challenge. They're a B2B organization. They had this gigaton challenge, as they called it, to reduce 1 billion tons of emissions. But they did it in such a collaborative way across the organization. So, and we produced communications for them right from the talent acquisition, tell people about it when you're interviewing them, and this is what they're going to get involved in. The engineering team were coming up with innovations for the technology, so that they could reduce emissions. Their sales team, were out there selling the more sustainable products. So everyone felt like they were really much part of meeting this, and because it was like a big challenge, like a competition, there was that element, and they just did it really, really well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
think it can be done, but you've really got to know your organization.
Yeah, it's a huge deliberate effort. And thank you. Johannes, any examples that spring to mind from your side?
Yeah, I got two. One is a very straightforward one. When working with WWF, this NGO with the panda, when I got to start there, they had a policy saying within Europe, whatever can be reached within 12 hours of public transport, you don't use an airplane to fly there. And everyone does it. No one in WWF flies basically anywhere in Europe apart from say the UK or but and that was very inspiring because everyone followed also the example of the sea suit who would also not fly if they could reach their destination within 12 hours on a train. And basically you can also work on the train. So this is 15 years ago. I think it was not that not common sense that you can also work quite effectively on trains. Now I think more people get into the habit of working on trains, at least when I do train travels. And we've seen our clients also go in as a good example from Vienna to Barcelona into trains, the night train to Paris, the day train to Barcelona, communicating about it and then asking the staff to follow suit. And I like that quite a lot. If you think of, because we just touched France, if you think of the Fresque du Climat, I'm not sure if all of you know it. So this is basically a very interactive game where people are empowered to play with a set of cards with basically every target group you can think of and explain climate and climate change and what you can do about it. If you think of companies who allow staff to be trained as climate fresque, which is the English name of Fresque du Climat, to allow them play and be trained and undergo train the trainers programs to do it inside the company, but also then play it with their friends, with their relatives, and so on and so forth. You support something very meaningful. And it turns out that in France there is millions of people that played this particular game, and it's hard. That's at least what I've been told. It's hard to find organizations who haven't yet played this game with at least parts of their stuff. So contributing to something that is more like a movement that empowers everyone, that's something where I think you can create lots of impact very efficiently and effectively.
I love that. Great example. Chris, anything from your side?
One thought. I mean, one of the things we do when we're trying to drive behavioral change is to work with our team of behavioral scientists and to engage them in using those nudge theories in order to drive changes. And very simple changes can actually be extremely effective. And what Johannes mentioned there was choice editing, which is obviously taking away the options of flying, for example, as a means of actually making the choice much more simple to make the sustainable choice. But I remember one program working with our behavioral scientists. We were working with an energy supplier. They had two almost identical buildings that they supplied, and had the same sort of building management systems, very efficient. We wanted to sort of show how those systems could really drive energy efficiency. But we also wanted to introduce behavioral nudges. And because there were two almost identical buildings, we introduced those in one building first and then the other. And actually we saw through using those nudges an 8% reduction in energy usage. Purely as a result of the introduction of those nudges and getting people to see and understand that change in more personal terms. But the final point I'd leave with is always remember the competition. People are competitive, and actually, what we did next after achieving that 8% was to have the building opposite try and beat that with their own interventions. And we got I forget the figure, but we got a significant reduction there as a result as well. I think people like to have a sense of competition at work, like, when that's done in a healthy way and it's not sort of, detrimental. I think it can be a really useful motivating factor.
Yeah, tapping into that fundamental human need. Okay, excellent. So we've discussed trust, strategy, engagement. I'd like to finish by focusing on leadership and what comes next. So, Susie, if we look, organizations are increasingly recognizing that driving sustainability narratives for meaningful impact cannot sit solely with the communications teams.
No.
What role should leadership play in shaping credible ESG narratives, and how can communicators help leaders and work with leaders to communicate authentically and effectively?
Good question. Big topic. So leadership is hugely important. It's important because we know that values within organizations are lived experiences by the people, and leaders are really in charge of setting that agenda and setting that culture. Not just that, they need, great teams around them, but I think in the situation with sustainability, if you have a sustainability narrative that your communications and marketing team are creating, but your leadership decision making is going in a different direction, then that's going to be transparent quite quickly, not just inside your organization, but outside of your organization as well. So if you want it to not look like a tick box exercise and actually be something that is part of a credible strategy that builds that trust that we know is so important, it's really important that leadership understand that and own that. I think it depends on the context and also the culture of the organization. I've worked with an organization I won't name, where it's very clear that there has been a narrative that has been driven from the top, which was unfortunately very different to what was coming out of all stakeholder engagement. And so the problem when you then try to communicate that is you then realize you're trying to communicate something that has little evidence and substance, and you can't back that up. And so, but if leadership isn't listening, then that's tricky. I also think where leaders are operating now in organizations where we can't expect that sustainability narrative to fall with everybody, land with everybody the same way. I've spoken to employees for clients who are, Gen Z, millennials, and they have a very different value set coming into organizations. They have expectations that those sustainability commitments are going to be, followed through. And if not, they'll walk. And I've had people say that to me. The reason I'm still with this organization is because they're walking the talk of what they told me, when I joined. So I think it's really important to meet those expectations. But I do think that the comms advisory role is really important. So this is where we are moving into that truly strategic communications role. We're not just crafting a message for a leader. We're actually helping that leader navigate what is at the moment a very complex and uncertain landscape. And it's helping them to be more comfortable with how to lead through uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. Critical points. So I'd like to end by looking to the future. And this is going to be a quick sort of fire round to hear from all of you in a tweet. If we're sitting here 5 years from now, what will define successful climate and ESG communications? Marion, can we start with you?
Well, I think organizations will have facts and figures on hand and can show real climate impact by then, because otherwise they have lost every trust, I think, when it comes to sustainability. So they need to be quite within the transformation process and not only at the start of it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great point. Chris?
Well, to go back to that leadership point, I would not want to be the CEO who in 5 years' time has to explain why they've not successfully delivered against the climate goals that they set and have reported on every year for the last decade.
Yeah.
And so what would success look like? I mean, it's got to be about delivery. It's communications that drives delivery. We're in that mode now. And I think the only other thing I would say is that in this current context, there's a real dearth of leadership. And we are, I think, in the next few years, it will look different, but we're going to need some new leaders to rally behind. And I'm looking forward to seeing who they will be and what they're going to champion, because that will be a key part of successful communications in this space as well.
Johannes, from you?
Well, I've got two points here. I think good or best practice would be to definitely go and stay beyond compliance and do more than is asked of you, so that with the next change of legislation or leadership on different country levels, so that this doesn't destroy everything. But if I could make a wish, and since Chris, you mentioned the WEF and misinformation and disinformation basically being seen as the second or third most important threat in the world, I would wish communicators to also proactively call out and take a stance against mis and disinformation, and really support those out there that really fight against fake news, misinformation, and the like. So that would be on my wish list for 2031. Yes, 5 years from now.
Thank you. Susie, your closing thoughts on the future gazing piece?
I think trust is the best currency we have as organisations, and I think that's going to continue to be a great competitive edge. I think how organisations sit within communities. The past 6 months, I've spent my time talking about social licence to operate more than I ever have done, and I think that's consistency. It's consistency over campaigns. Consistency builds trust.
Absolutely. So true. So true. Listen, there's so much to discuss, and I think we've only scratched the surface here today. Today's discussion has really sort of highlighted that successful ESG communications is no longer about just telling sustainability stories. You know, it's about creating that credibility, enabling action, helping organizations deliver that meaningful change. So thank you all to this fantastic panel for your insights. Chris, Johannes, Marion, Susie, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think there are questions coming through, but I think if you can email Jolyn with any of those questions, and I think this webinar will be also be displayed on the ICCO website shortly. And I think information, Johannes, we touched earlier on the sustainability comms training that you mentioned, so details of that will be included there too. So thank you so much to ICCO, to the Public Relations Association of Austria for bringing us together today. And thank you to all who joined us today. And I wish you a wonderful day and evening further. And
I'm going to bed now, thank you.
Good night. Yes. Good night, Susie.
Good night from New Zealand.
Have a good one. Cheers, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yes.
Bye.